say that this is a faith where you can believe anything you want. And it's come up in some of the readings, and it's something that I want to be able to answer to in an elevator speech kind of way. And right now I don't have that in my back pocket. And I feel like, you know, I haven't sort of germinated it yet, but the seed and the kernel is starting to grow.
Great. You want to pass it to someone?
Next up on my screen is Perry.
Okay. Let's see. Well, I'm supposed to be on vacation this week, but, so I'm in Michigan right now visiting my wife's family, which is really nice. And as you might imagine, in a purple state, our family is kind of split politically. So I've kind of had my full share of Fox News for, like, this week will give me my fill for the year, I think. So that's interesting. Especially this week. But otherwise good, and looking forward to landing and heading to Ocean Grove. In the congregation, we're starting to do a lot of work on adult faith formation, which is information. And so I think it's really interesting to bring all of this theology into what we're considering with that. And I also had a conversation with a visitor recently where it was helpful just to give them a tiny bit of historical context, like them coming in and not knowing that actually, oh, there is a history here, because sometimes people have no idea. They think, you know, is this sort of non-denominational? Is it, you know, is it a recent thing? You know, what is it? And the idea that some of the things they're thinking about, that there's actually a history to it in our faith. Nice for them to know without overwhelming them.
All right, you want to pass it, Perry?
Let's see, after my screen, the next person is Lily.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Perry. So I'm at work right now. It's been kind of like one of those busy summers. And I'm appreciating the reading of this class because it kind of brings back meaning into everything that we do. And I think what strikes me, or that stays with me, is having that prophetic voice. You know, even though we are educators, but being responsible for for making history instead of just and that takes a knowing who we are. So I think that if I have a stronger understanding than those that are around me, I'll be able to influence in everything that I do, in the little things. And I think that that's important because we are a faith community, and God someplace is in there, whatever it is that we call it. So I'll call on Margie.
Hi, good morning, afternoon. I'm a little confused today. My whole plan's changed. First of all, I'm doing pretty good. I'm been fighting poison ivy on my face and now have some kind of secondary infection they can't identify. So back on some other medications. I rushed home from the doctor to try to get here on time. I made it, but now I have to go back out to get medication, but that's okay. I just want to be, so I can participate next week without sitting there scratching myself to death. I'm finally getting caught up on the reading. I was a little behind the last 2 weeks, and I'm finding it very helpful and very useful to see behind a lot of what we've been teaching. You know, not having that some of this background before, yeah, I understood what I was teaching, but I didn't have the context for it in many cases. So this has really been helpful for that. Helpful with the children as well. Not that you necessarily spell out this kind of background, but it can really help in answering questions in a more reasonable kind of way, and especially with the youth. So I'm happy about that. I agree with Stacy that it can really help in sort of coming up with it. How do you respond to, and to children, to adults, to especially adults and visitors? You know, you can believe whatever you want. Well, and it really made me see more how I got to Unitarian Universalism and why it appeals so much to me. And I think having that better understanding myself helps me in teaching and preparing programs. So I'm becoming much more pleased with this as I understand it more. Call on somebody if I can see some names.
Ashley and Lacey are the two.
Okay, how about Ashley?
Hi, so let's see. I am feeling a little tired already. This is my second week back at work, or week and a half, I guess, after a couple weeks of vacation, which was really nice. I was down in North Carolina visiting family. So it just feels like we're rushing in to take off for the fall and a lot going on. I think for me, I was really just interested in, I can't remember exactly which reading it was, but talking about how important it is to connect with our Christian and Judaic roots. And because Unitarianism and Universalism did come out of those so closely. And I was just noticing before I got here, I'm fairly new, very new, the RE committee had put in place 3 pillars to be alternated each year for UU identity and social justice, and then world religions, and to alternate those topics or those themes each year. And I've noticed in some other literature that those 3 pillars are UU identity, and then the Christian Judeo heritage, and then world religion. So I was just interested that social justice was put in, which is great, but I know there's a lot of issues around the Christian part, the Christian heritage of UUs, and I'm just interested in how we can kind of reclaim or draw from the good parts of that heritage, because I think it would be beneficial, but without hurting anyone, or you know, I'm not sure if we could do it without angering anyone, because it's a touchy subject, but that's kind of where my bubbles are popping. So let's see, Lacey, is that who? I don't see her on my screen, sorry. Okay.
I'm still in transition, so I was not able to get in front of a computer screen just yet. I have had a very busy summer. I have been in the process of moving this summer, and my wife got a job that has us moving our household to Ohio, even though I am keeping my job in Massachusetts. So we're trying to just get everything kind of established and move, and, you know, 2 places to live, all these sorts of things. So my summer has been just especially busy. So that's where my summer is. I am not yet to the place of application with the things that I'm learning. I mean, the reason I took this this module is because I feel like I don't have the, you know, I have I don't come out of a UU tradition whenever I came into my work and this where I am now. And I just needed a better theological sense of where sort of UUs are and what does that mean when I say UU theology. And, you know, my sense of history was much, I think, better on some level than my sense of theology. And so I think like part of what is happening for me in the course of this time has really just been like, I can take what I know and look at it in a different way. And so that's, I mean, it's personally edifying. I don't yet know how one might use that past for my own edification.
That's great, Lacey. Thank you. We're all works in progress, so I appreciate that you're here, even though you're definitely in some big transition there. Well, great. Thanks, everybody. It's good to hear from you. I think we're going to move on and let Emily take us into the world of transcendentalism.
Transcendentalism. So I think that I'd like to hear from you before we get started. When you hear the word transcendentalism, either in our churches or just in general, what are things that first come to your mind?
Walden Pond.
Walden Pond?
Personal experience, nature.
I was going to say nature with a capital N.
The word nature came to me too.
Any last first impressions?
Just the rebellion thing against what was the norm at the time. Radicalism.
Radicalism. Okay. So I feel like I first started hearing about transcendentalism, of course, as a UU, specifically through people. Like, oh, do you know Ralph Waldo Emerson was Unitarian? Did you know William Ellery Channing was Unitarian? Did you know Henry David Thoreau was like, yeah. So I heard the names first. I knew the people first before I really knew what is transcendentalism. And I think what's interesting for me, having grown up Unitarian Universalism and even reading Emerson when I was 8 years old, just so you know about my history of why I'm a little bit of a UU theology nerd, having read Emerson when I was young, or reading some of these great thinkers that people were really impressed by, I still was like, what is transcendentalism? Like, what is it? And it took me until college and seminary to actually learn what transcendentalism was versus the things I knew about the people who were transcendentalists, if that makes sense. So I'm going to give a brief overview of transcendentalism itself. And sometimes it's hard for me to wrap, I don't know if I'm going to completely and very accurately describe it, because it's still sometimes a little hard for me to wrap my mind around exactly how it fits theologically, but I'm going to give it my best shot, okay? Transcendentalism is the understanding that every human person can transcend their rational, immediate bodily senses, that they have a function within them, whether it's intuition or feeling, that transcends this world and connects with God and the divine. There are different terms that you might hear transcendentalists use, especially Ralph Waldo Emerson use, such as the oversoul, or the ultimate reality or ultimate being, or nature with a capital N. This understanding that there's a wider reality, a bigger picture behind the surface of what we can perceive, hear, touch, and feel. That is just as important. In fact, it's actually of, well, by their arguments, more importance than our physical, tangible world. For transcendentalists, it's those things that are taught by feeling and intuition that are things like morals or ethics. They are those things that remind us of our connection to the wider world and the divine. It is that larger, wider sense when we lose our sense of ego and realize how much a part of the whole universe and the whole picture we are, that we are reminded of our ultimate purpose and our ultimate meaning. That's me trying to put transcendentalism in a nutshell. And also, different transcendentalists had different versions of it and focused on different parts of it. So we read a little bit of Margaret Fuller, who focused a little bit on self-culture. In transcendentalism, it focuses a lot on improving yourself, whether that's through education, whether that's through learning more, testing your reason and your knowledge, continually questioning yourself, is understanding that it's so important to nurture and continually grow yourself in relationship to others, to expand your knowledge, and to remind yourself of the wider picture that you're part of. I would say Emerson probably also focused a lot on self-culture. He also focused a lot on nature with a capital N. He talked a lot about the divine that he would see, whether that was through his own perception while walking through nature or through the woods, whether that was when he meditated. A lot of his poetry really says this perfectly. He has a poem that talks about, I'll give you a brief synopsis of it. It talks about different elements of nature, and he takes a seashell from the sea. He's like, oh, I took it home and now it's kind of dull and boring, but when it was part of the sea, part of the greater world, it was really beautiful and shiny and glittery. And he uses that as an illusion of, if we remove ourselves and focus just on ourselves as egos and remove ourselves from the wider nature of God or of the divine, then we lose the beauty that it is to be human. So Emerson did a lot with the capital N nature, as did Thoreau. Thoreau literally escaped into the woods for months to figure out what it meant to be human, to study, really, what it meant to be human and perpetuate this self-culture. Theodore Parker ends up focusing transcendentalism on the transcendent messages within religion, which is why he became a radical and revolutionary for Unitarians at the time and why they were upset with him. Instead of saying, oh, you know, Jesus is the one or only Savior or the main prophet we should focus on, he says, well, there are things across religions and across religious literature that point to the truth of what it means to be human, that transcend the particularities of those religions and remind us of the nature of the holy and the nature of our souls. That was pretty radical for the 1880s, for someone to say, oh, yeah, you know, Jesus doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter what you believe. We're all going to be connected with God anyway, because it transcends the particularities of faith. So you can see that transcendentalism started to lay this foundation where we didn't take the Bible as literally, where there were people who understood the Bible as a series of myths and started using the word myths to describe the Bible, where we had people who wanted more to use reason and their own understanding of themselves to tap into that intuition, into that feeling of what it meant to be human and to be a person, to transcend all of their small particularities around life into their understanding of how they fit with God. For me, I feel, one last thing before I move on. Emerson, I think for me, actually did something really unique for this time. He was the first person, and Transcendentalists actually were the first person to translate Sanskrit into English and to start reading the Hindu tradition texts. And he uses in his own poetry, with his own published works, the word Brahma and Brahmin over and over and over again, because he's using it as his oddly interfaith translated way of trying to point at the nature of God that he understands. That God is this thing that we're all a part of, where if we lose sense of our individual selves, we can see how we're a part of God. That's a radical version of theology in a time that's still reacting to Calvinism and Puritanism here in the United States, which was a little bit of an after effect sometime in the mid-1800s. Okay. So I've just talked a lot at you. What are some of the things that stick out for you from what I've said or what you've read about transcendentalism this week?
I love some of the self-culture things that they did, just being in nature, writing, the conversations that they had, especially the conversational circles that were organized to talk and improve themselves. I thought that was really, sounded like something I would have loved to be a part of. And what else was there? The journaling. I can't remember everything now, but it was just really wonderful to read about kind of how they were. Oh, and the farms, the collective groups that they had.
Anybody else? I'm going to ask you some questions, don't worry, but just ask just any observations first or thoughts.
I've been amused by some recent things that I've read about Thoreau and how, you know, he sort of became this paragon of self-reliance and back to nature. But when he went to the woods in Walden, he walked into town every day, and his mother did his laundry, and I mean, he was really still very connected, but yet he wrote this experience as though he was very isolated. So that is amusing and interesting.
Patricia, before you go off, what did you think of my explanation? Is there any gaps that I'm missing?
No, I thought your explanation was really interesting, and I loved a couple of your metaphors were fabulous. So
I also want to respond to you know, I kind of laugh when I think about Walden Pond, because again, like you said, Patricia, here's this guy who's like really now become the model in American culture of self-reliance, almost like the ultimate lumberjack in essence. But Walden Pond was Emerson's backyard. Like literally his best friend's backyard is where he was staying. His mother did his laundry. He walked into town, which was a 10-minute walk away. Like, I think what I find interesting now is reading through the self-reliance that Henry David Thoreau did takes a little bit of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And this understanding in transcendentalism, because again, it's this, you're trying to get yourself elevated, this focus on the individual, that even if its purpose is to see how much a part of nature you are, doesn't really do a good job at claiming interdependence or how we're dependent and reliant on each other as communities. Sometimes I think an affect of transcendentalism is that there's so much self-culture that we have a hyper sense of individualism instead of a sense of, if we really are all a part of nature, then we're part of this interconnected and interdependent web, and how are we part of that? Right? Yeah.
So it's interesting though, like that thing of the you're transcending, so you're always kind of going to this higher, bigger, 60,000 foot picture, and yet somehow, I don't know, somehow it was also brought to ground at times in like Thoreau doing the, you know, when he didn't pay his taxes because of the war. And, you know, so how, yeah, they didn't always overtly state it, but somehow they were taking, oh, that moral ground I'm finding inside of myself, and then I'm going to put it into action at times. I don't know, it's interesting how that would happen.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating.
Maybe part of the self-reliance, I was thinking about how a big difference for it in religiously was the direct access. You know, they were encouraging people so much to have direct access to whatever their spirituality and God was, and it wasn't being defined for you. You know, it was like you're discovering it. And so maybe that was a big piece of the self-reliance idea was, you know, the self-reliance of your own spiritual growth. You know, you're not dependent on being in the pew or listening to a priest or minister.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're right there, that there's this focus on wanting to encourage direct access, and self-reflection when it came to all kinds of reflections of spiritual and theological nature, to the point where what I find so ironic, particularly about Ralph Waldo Emerson, is that Unitarians, we laud him over and over again. He was so great. He was a revolutionary. He changed our faith forever. Well, did you know that he quit the church? He was a minister who stopped serving communion because he didn't believe in it anymore. He went off to go in the woods to separate himself from being a Unitarian and focus on his own self journey. And now what's funny about our living tradition is it wasn't that long after that. It was maybe, 40 years? And people started saying, yes, Emerson's part of our faith, and it means to be Unitarian is to have direct access to the divine. Isn't it great? Right? So he encouraged direct access so much that he left the church. And I wonder how to be a religious community that keeps a community together while still encouraging individual direct access to spiritual life.
As I'm listening to all this, I had this epitome kind of. In the Asian culture, you know how they have yin and yang, right? They fit together, they complement each other, yin and yang. You know what the opposite of nature is? It's civilization. And so it's kind of interesting how these folks, these thinkers, broke away from what the civilized thought was and created something that was more, dare I say, natural, inner. So it's just interesting, and I hadn't made that connection before. But being self is also nature. Being true to yourself.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask some of the questions that we have for this time. Like I mentioned a little earlier that in this time, Theodore Parker, again, we talked a lot about Emerson and Thoreau. Theodore Parker is a little bit different. He came later, having learned a lot and being part of this, of the wider transcendental community. But he was the one that really spoke, all of them did in some way, but he really came after the particularities of religion and how, in his essay, The Transient and the Permanent, which is, what is the passing phase in religious life, and what is the permanent message that's trying to be told? That's where he talked about, doesn't really matter what it literally says in the Bible or what Jesus was. What is the permanent message behind it? How are we supposed to relate as human beings? And gets into this place of pluralism that we really haven't had before. So we know that Parker was shunned by most Unitarians at the time. How do you think contemporary Unitarian Universalists would respond to his thoughts or his theology?
It seems to me like it's a complete flipping of the roles there, that now if someone came forward and said, no, it is really important to know what the Bible means to us, that would be rejected by many or most UUs that I know. Whereas this idea of Parker that, you know, there's something beyond just the words written down on the page, and that no, you know, not the Bible, and if you expand it out, not any of these religious texts are going to be able to give you the one truth. There's something bigger than that.
Yeah. In fact, if you've ever read a recent text by, the chapter done by it was either by Forrest Church or it was John Barron's, but they talk about the cathedral of the world, where the light of the universe is shining through different windows. The different windows are religions. That is basically Theodore Parker in a modern theologian. Yeah. Oh, thanks. Any other thoughts on Theodore Parker?
Well, I mean, in the context of what you're asking, I wonder about, like, you know, people who are strong on UU identity right now, like as being a big push, especially in religious education, whatever. Like, I wonder how he would respond to that.
I wonder how he'd respond to that too. I don't know. I don't know. Part I wonder if he wouldn't mind it, and part I would wonder if he'd sat down arguing with religious educators about it. I almost think that it could be both. Wow. I'm going to move on to our next and last question about transcendentalism. Which actually, the questions they give are like 3 questions in 1 question, so I'm going to take it one at a time. Do you think that there's anything in transcendentalism that we've talked about that connects with contemporary Unitarian Universalism? And what would that be?
Well, they seem to take the moral outcomes of their experience into kind of social justice work. And I know on the one of the farms, they wanted everyone to have equal pay, I think. But, you know, they worked for a lot of different social justice causes. So that's kind of what stuck out to me.
They were really big on making sure that their practice of faith wasn't just heading out in nature, but was really putting the morals and lessons they learned about being human into action.
Seems like even though they were relating it directly to religion more so than we are today, it seems like they were like the spiritual but not religious group of their time, you know, like it's like, and that's sort of the, you know, biggest number of UUs now, and the group that we sort of are identifying ourselves or saying, you know, hey, we should have all of those people in our congregations. That idea of the free and responsible search, but, you know, okay, we're not going to be too attached to the ritual and any of the dogma and whatever. So
absolutely. Anybody else? Patricia, do you want to take a stab at it? What do you see that how transcendentalism connects with our modern UU life?
Well, I do see a lot of hero worship for Thoreau that manifests as commitment to environmental justice or community gardens and that kind of thing. I think that that's sort of embodied practice. That's not, I don't know that people are really making that full intellectual connection with the theology that might be behind the work and the story, the narrative of Thoreau in his time. But we have our Green Sanctuary movement, and that seems to be something that there's lots of passion and energy around in our congregations. And it's because it's very tactile and hands-on that those kinds of projects and concepts trickle down into religious education really easily. So we love to put our children out in the garden, or to give them those group experiences in nature.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking also the Emerson thing, I'm not going to remember it exactly, but provocation, not instruction, that I get from another, in faith formation, religious education, that's sort of our movement now, is that we don't want this to be school. And, we're not teachers standing up there and teaching the Bible or teaching something, that it's about experience and how are we provoking you to think and to, experience something different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. There's one other thing I'll mention. I recognize that I worded something difficultly, so I'm going to try to reframe it. It's not that Transcendentalism was against the use of rational reason or science or thought. Actually, they were really, really into, they wanted empirical evidence. They wanted to follow they wanted conversations to learn and have more knowledge. It was, again, so it's not about a lack of rationalism or the use of senses. It was this fact that they wanted to get to this underlying feeling, which is why they use words like nature or soul or heart, because they wanted to get to this feeling they felt was underneath it that was being escaped. In fact, the rise of Transcendentalism, as was in that New Spirituality article we read, it points out that Transcendentalists at the time were protesting a lack of religious feeling and enthusiasm among the Unitarians because of exaggerated rationalism. As Theodore Parker expressed it, I felt early that liberal ministers did not do justice to simple religious feeling. Their preaching seemed to relate too much to duty, work, and they failed to address with equal the power of the soul to shout joy, delight. I actually find that really relevant to what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years in Unitarian Universalism. We've had a pushback against, you'll see that in time with our living tradition, the pendulum just keeps swinging back and forth. And we've now had a push against the rationality of humanism in a way, and that there's this expression lately, at least, maybe unnamed, maybe under the ceiling, but especially I think sometimes from leaders of color and others, that we want some feeling in our services. We want some joy. We want some of that passion back. And we've been exploring that with each other in ways that now try to use religious language like God, or try to bring back different kinds of hymns and music and styles of worship to incorporate religious. So I see that as being related to our contemporary space. One very last question on this Transcendentalism, then we'll go on to humanism. That is, what do you think doesn't work? If we put all the Transcendentalism stuff from the 1880s and planted it in one of our churches today, what do you think doesn't work or doesn't mesh with who we are today?
I don't know if this answers the question, but it's interesting that that wanting more healing and spirituality like at the time, right, like William Ellery Chaney was talking about their revolt was against Calvinism, but also like the evangelists of their time. I can't remember what the name was, but like, you know, the spiritualists and evangelists who they found like doing these like rah-rah preachings who they thought were just totally wacky and had no reason whatsoever and were just stirring people up at the time. It's like so Unitarian went really rational, sort of against that, and it's saying, oh, bring some of that back in the same way that, yeah, the last, you know, like 40 years ago, Unitarians were doing, and now saying, wait, we need some of that, but we just don't need it in the way that like an evangelist congregation might bring it.
Yeah.
So it's like that, like Lily was saying about the balance, you know, it's like holding both of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on this question?
I think we already talked about the idea of community and the interconnected web versus the individuality. So bring that up again. But.
Yeah.
And I always encourage folks to study, to delve a little deeper into Margaret Fuller. Margaret doesn't have quite that rock star status that some of our other transcendentalists have, but there are some historians and biographers who think that some of her best ideas were co-opted by some of those folks, and that she really, really had a lot more impact on transcendentalism than she is given credit for. So she's a great character, a fascinating story.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it's interesting because there are some conversations I've been in where folks say that part of that pendulum swing from a really rational UUism towards this more spiritual, that part of that shift was because we became a majority female identified ministry leading Unitarian Universalism, and so there was this gendered influence, which there's lots of complexity in that, but there's a connection there between Margaret's contribution to transcendentalism and where we are moving towards, have been moving in this more spiritual direction. Did that make sense?
So there's one more challenge that I want to leave at the feet of transcendentalism. It's hard because, I mean, I have to say my heart has always loved transcendentalism ever since I was a kid, and I loved it so much. But there is a warning that I feel can be taken from this, much like, of course, as we've been talking about Henry David Thoreau writing this wonderful piece about self-reliance, and he ends up being in someone's backyard and his mom's doing his laundry, right? When an individual person tries to universalize what they are thinking, it can perpetuate privilege and injustice, whether or not it was conscious. And I see that, whether that's in Emerson's possible co-opting of Margaret Fuller's work, whether that's in Emerson's use of the word man over and over again to mean humanity, whether that's in the ways that Thoreau was talking about self-reliance and who has the ability to be self-reliant. I think it's important for all of us, whether it's transcendentalism or throughout any of the theologies we have, to just note when we say we, or when we try to universalize that kind of connection of, oh, I have access to the divine, I have access to this universal, to keep a challenge in mind. That is that the divine I'm connecting to, or is that where are the limits of my perception and where are the limits of my identities and life have with that understanding? I wish sometimes that Ralph Emerson could be alive to have talked to James Cone, the founder of Black Liberation Theology, because I would want to be there for that conversation and see what they had to say. Yeah. All right. I will leave you with that.
Perfect timing. Oh, wow, what a great conversation. We're going to take our 5-minute break and try to clear the palate, as it were, for a conversation around humanism. So we're stepping into the late 19th, early 20th century, moving down the timeline. So we will see you at 2 o'clock. I've got 1:55 here, 1:56. So we'll see you at 2:01.
Are we all back?
Looks like we're mostly back. Yeah.
All right.
Yay.
It's time to
So,
talk about humanism.
yeah.
Okay. So I have a feeling that many may have heard humanism before doing this reading. When you hear the word humanist, what are some of the first things that come to mind for you?
I associate it with the word secular because I often hear of secular humanism.
Yep.
I think of it as a mainly white male perspective. There may have been some women who signed on to the original documents, but I think of it as primarily being influenced by through the lens of white males.
Also, there's a centering around a person as opposed to a centering around something that's greater than us.
I was trying to figure out how to word that. I sort of looked at it like godless, or
Any other takers?
Man can create his own happiness and destiny.
Yeah. Yeah, so all of the observations that you made are pretty on the nose for humanism. At least humanism as it's known today, much of it is known as secular because of the American Humanist Association proclaiming to be primarily secular. But religious humanism does exist, as many of us as Unitarian Universalists know, because we have many religious humanists in our congregations. As well as, we are not the only ones, however, there are many other societies much like it, like the Ethical Culture Society, or even places that gather solely for humanism. So there is such a thing as religious humanists. They do exist. And there's also secular humanism. The origins of humanism, I feel like you can see the push and pull that happened with transcendentalism that created humanism. So in transcendentalism, when you had a foundation of focusing on direct access to spirituality, focusing on individual connection with the world and self-culture, and the transient and the permanent, what really matters versus what is passing, it sets the stage for someone to be like, well, maybe God's not really the main focus here. Maybe the main focus is what it means to be human and how we live good and purposeful lives and how we create both meaning as well as ethical, moral living. So you can see how that foundation made it possible. Also, transcendentalism set the stage by inviting people to really search for truth and meaning themselves, to use their reason and their conscience to question things around religion and to search for new truths and new experiences. And also, humanism, like that pendulum swing we talked about, is also a reaction against transcendentalism. Actually, in the first Humanist Manifesto, it says that humanists find the traditional dualism of mind and body must be rejected. Transcendentalism was all about losing your sense of your body and focusing on the soul, on the feeling of religious intuition, and forming with a one union with the divine. Humanism is actually a reaction, a rationalist reaction against that, being like, what is this? Not that humanists are not unfeeling, they very are much passionate, but against this kind of sense of this more mystic quality that you find in transcendentalism, that you can transcend into God. There was like, no. We don't want to transcend reality. We don't want to transcend who we are and our lived experiences and being in our bodies. This, the now, the here, what I can touch is what matters. So you can find that yin and yang there. All that to say, transcendentalism opened the door for people to start wondering about, well, is there really a God? If we can take an understanding that maybe everything in the Bible doesn't have to be taken literally, and maybe we can find religious experiences for ourselves, is there a God? Does there have to be a God? What is the purpose of religion? And I honestly think that humanism answers the question, what is the purpose of religion, more than it answers, is there or is there not a God? At the early beginning stages of humanism, meaning, I'm not going to have exact dates, so please bear with me, but around the turn of the 1900s all the way into the 1930s, there were theists who were humanists, and very loud about it too. There were people who believed in God but were also humanists and called themselves humanists because they understood that the primary focus of religion was not about God, but was about how we as human beings create a meaningful life and what we do in this world with each other. That would eventually evolve, though. Many humanists do understand that there isn't really a God, particularly because of their sense of appreciating science, rejecting religion as an institution for the way that it's hurt and perpetuated harm, and wanting to separate away from traditional understandings of spirituality to focus on what we're responsible for as human beings in this life. You can see it in the first Humanist Manifesto. It talks a lot about rejecting, has some pretty challenging language for me as a minister, but things like, I reject all superstition, we discourage sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. They have lines about understanding that transformation isn't something that happens with a spirit or spiritual. It is an intelligent evaluation that is part of what how we relate to each other as social human beings. So you can see this trajectory away from the over-heightened spiritual sense into the more rational, concrete sense of what is around us and what it means to be human. And it is what I love about humanism is that it focuses on what is our responsibility in regards to religion. To be a humanist means you no longer have the option to say somebody else told you what to believe in, and you no longer have the option to think that your actions or the way you live your life does not have consequences. For humanism, you are responsible for creating the world that's going to be the future. And it also has an optimistic perspective of humans, that we can create a world that is liberative, that is filled with justice, that is better than the one we were given, and that we can change the world just by focusing on what it means to value the human individual. All right. Pat, what do you think of my humanism summary? Anything to add?
No, good job. Good job. I think it will be an interesting I really want to hear from folks where they see those strands of humanism still very much at play in our Unitarian Universalist congregations, because interestingly, I think a lot of congregations call themselves that. Oh, we're a humanist congregation, but I think if they really take a moment and examine where they actually are, I think that we have in fact moved away. So be interested to hear what it looks like where you are on the ground.
And I really do like Reverend Kendall Gibbons' Essentials of Humanism summary. I think it's perfect. It really is perfect about what in humanism values. One that I'm going to read just some quotes from it again. Humanists, what humanists trust is that which can be proven either by evidence and science and careful study, or else by the cumulative moral insight and experience of humanity. It's not sacred scripture, it is our own experiences with the world. Also, I love how she leaves room for theism in humanism here a little bit. She says, some humanists are persuaded on what seems to be good evidence that the existence of a personal deity is clearly impossible. Others take a position of intellectual modesty, which holds there is insufficient evidence for us as human beings to know whether God exists or not. Yet with all of these types of humanists in common is far more significant because we focus on what it means to be human together. Yeah, okay. So any other thoughts from what we just talked about before I go into the questions?
I'm wondering, was humanism, I mean, is this something that you were aware of before doing this reading? Did this feel like we're moving towards a more modern understanding of our theology? Or does this still feel like it is in the past, according to the Lion King?
This is Margie. To me, it felt more like what I've known and what I've experienced and worked with. So it felt very comfortable, not such an unknown type of thing. My particular congregation, the word God is not a word that's used typically. And our children, a lot of them will say, what is God? But they just haven't heard it. It's until a certain age when they're hearing it from their friends at school and all. But there's a lot of shying away from it. I've had teachers who will not teach a lesson that has God in it. So not much discussion about it, though, unfortunately. We had a humanist group that met every Sunday or once a month, and as people aged, they sort of petered out of that, although I see the stirrings to resume some of that now.
Great.
I had kind of a little bit of an out there connection that popped up for me, in that when you were talking about the Humanist Manifesto and mentioning things like, not having any superstitious thoughts or, supernatural thoughts or anything along those lines, that really conflicts with how Unitarian Universalism has accepted paganism into it. And then that kernel of science and reason being this altogether important thing, and how a lot of discussion is happening amongst pagans and people of earth spirituality and things about how physics is starting to catch up to their sort of understanding of the supernatural, and things like string theory are showing that we're all actually very interconnected and everything, and that maybe humanism and these supernatural ideas are eventually going to converge.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you for highlighting that. I will admit, okay, I will admit to myself that when I read the Humanist Manifesto, specifically around calling the God supernatural and not wanting to use the word God, and why it doesn't use it, makes me as a UU minister, though I know myself personally as a theist, but beyond that, as a UU, makes me a little uncomfortable, just because, I mean, my dad's an atheist, my mom's a Catholic, like, we're all in the same church together. And so sometimes I see that, but it also highlights maybe some of the tension you might have picked up in congregations occasionally, or even just among UU members, where you'll see someone maybe who is pagan and talks about their experiences, and the person next to them being like, or like, you can see that there's a little bit of that tension there, even in our congregations still, around how we talk about our own interfaith, intertheological diversity in a way that acknowledges the perspectives of humanists and atheists and agnostics, without having to demonize or invalidate theists, and vice versa as well. It's hard. It's hard.
So interesting. I've been surprised to hear how many of our congregations and like with colleagues are still sort of entrenched in that traditional humanist piece of like, we're really not going to talk about God, and we're really humans, because I've been witnessing more in the congregations I've been in of that shift that's happening, where that's in the history, but it's now really it's moving into a different place where no, spirituality is going to be a part of what we do. And there's some parts of the congregation that struggle with that, but they're having to deal with it and figure it out in their own terms, which then, I mean, which works if you take the humanist focused from it's, about not believing in God, but instead it's about what humanism is in terms of the collective human good, and that our focus is on what we're doing for humanity, regardless of whether there's God or not, and why humanism can be both theist and atheist. So it's like that shift in humanism too, but for some reason it became entrenched as that sort of severe humanism. I don't know, so it can still be a part of what we're doing as we're realizing that that's not serving the needs of everybody who's in our congregation walking in our doors.
Perry, I think you just encapsulated a lot of things I'm noticing as well. And I think what I find interesting and struggling with, even within my own limited understandings of humanism, is that it's not like humanists or atheists don't have spirituality, or like it's impossible. Yeah, it's a word, maybe they want to use the word spirituality, and I don't really know of an equal word to use in its instance. If you come up with any, please let me know. But like, it's not like there are no like emotional feelings, social or moral consciousness, or questions about the bigger meaning of the world, right? And sometimes I wish there was a way to constructively talk about it that could actually open the doors within atheist and humanist thinking for those who don't use the word God to engage in a deeper level of spiritual reflection than they've been allowing themselves to do because they're so allergic to religious words. Does that make sense? It's something I struggle with.
Yeah. Actually, I remember a few years ago actually having a conversation with a humanist and having that person talking about their view of religion and whatever. And then I said, well, that part you're talking about there, that is spirituality. And the person was kind of like, well, if you want to call it that, but they weren't defining it that way, but it was. It's just they would never call it that.
I think that, I'm fairly new to this congregation, and the congregation I was in Idaho, I wasn't a DRE, so I didn't have a lot of deep conversations, but I think what I would observe is just, I don't really hear people talk about what their kind of core beliefs are very much, I kind of hear fringe statements, you know, or fringe ideas, whatever, even if it's an activity or something that they're doing that gives me a little bit of insight into, oh, they, you know, must be more of an earth religion type of person or this. But I can say that I have run in both congregations to a very kind of more textbook humanist, and both congregations happen to be in university towns, and I would say they were the retired professor, you know, older white male, just very textbook, more secular humanists, and they would be a little more outspoken that we shouldn't use God language and that kind of thing. So that's just, it's just an interesting experience, I guess, of that. But I don't see it very widespread in the in either congregation.
I want to just take a moment to note this. I'm at loss for words. I'm not trying to demonize humanism in any way. I'm just trying to be aware of the allergy, maybe that's too strong of a word, the tension of using traditional religious language, because it comes with baggage. And I know that our traditional humanists, I know the ones that in my congregation, they're the mainstays, the pillars of my congregation. They love it more than anything. And it reminds me of the faithful work that can happen without having to use any of the religious language either. There is a stalwartness with those humanist science like perspectives. Yeah. Anyway, any other observations before I move on to the next question? Well, I'm going to have us move on, but basically it's an extension of what we've already talked about. So I'm going to leave you with this question to think about for a while. What do you think is lost, or what do you think is gained when God is removed from religion?
Well, I think it can certainly take some of that power away for those who are then representatives of God. So when we take God out, then you have kind of a power structure that can be decentralized, or that you know, you can't have that access to God or knowing what God would say is kind of eliminated, in the power structure that goes with that.
I think some of the sort of mysticism and awe are lost when you take God away. When it becomes so scientific and rational, there's an answer to everything. You just have to get to it and find it. And I think a piece of spirituality is there's something I'm probably not going to get to, and that's okay. There's something else. May not be a bigger kind of thing like a God, but there's just something. On the other hand, I am a scientist, so I think there's a different kind of sense of awe gained. Especially I see it with our children when they put two and two together, when they learn something. Although in reality, in my mind, it's not just that you're putting facts and things together, you're also putting thoughts and feelings and things you can't touch together. And so you really sort of need parts of both to be able to do that.
What I think is gained when we lose God talk is a freedom of exploration around what is holy. Like Ashley said, some of the power differentials stop. We have an understanding of we're all in this together, human, interconnected, facing the mystery of what it is to be alive and having to die. And also, in the words of Chet Ramo, when God is gone, everything is holy. This opening up, this space where you can really get into a different kind of awe, a different kind of perspective around what is divine than what ends up being associated with traditional God language, depending on the level of institutional harm that has come with it. I especially think of my LGBTQ siblings of faith who have either had to redefine for themselves what God is, or have had to leave God behind to be able to really acknowledge the worth and holiness of life around them because of the harm that traditional church language has done. So sometimes it can be nice to get rid of those structures and thoughts to access a different kind of spirituality. Also responsibility, all those the kind of self-claimed, really high integrity faith comes with sometimes losing that language. What I feel is lost and I struggle with is, for lack of a better way of saying this, humility. Humanism, it's not that humanism doesn't have humility, it's that by focusing so much on the human and what the humans can do and what we're able of, it almost feels like we're continuing that Unitarian progress of mankind upwards and onwards forever, and not always able to really sit with the destruction that we cause each other, or where we fail, or what happens when it falls apart. In a way that those who believe in higher powers or in divinity or in different kinds of ways are able to, with my wife's Christian language, God is God and I am not, like able to understand, put in a different context human failing. So this is not as a way of saying humanism doesn't have room for that. Absolutely it does. I feel like it doesn't always get talked about. And I would challenge humanism to talk a little bit more about, so when humans aren't always good, what do we do?
Well, and I think just to build on what you were saying too, it's like, I think sometimes like when we don't have God language, it's the potential for all things to be holy. It's not necessarily that all things become holy in that, right? And so I think sometimes that, I say this as a person who believes in God, and that's structuring to the way I approach my life, right? I have a hard time sorting out how we get to holy without God. For me, I mean, like, I think folks who don't believe in God, it's real easy, right? But for like me, it's like there's this vehicle by which, you know, we access transcendence and holiness. And I mean, and I believe in a concept of God that's kind of ubiquitous, and where I think everything is holy anyway. But I don't know, I think when you don't have God or God language, it's like how do things become divine, right? Is the question. Like, that's the complex question. And like, how are things holy? You if we don't believe in a holy, how are things holy, or how do we experience transcendence? I think that gets a lot more complicated. And I think sometimes with humanism, I struggle with this ability when we kind of elevate the human being, the individual. I think there's this question about how do we then see structures that we are kind of imbricated in and we perpetuate, but that aren't just a person, right? Like I think humanism sometimes has a difficult time kind of addressing oppressive structures because we think of the human as it's so centralized. It makes it harder for us to see that like there are things at work outside of the singular experience of the individual.
Yes, yeah, I hear you.
Also, whether or not you believe in God or not, we all have an image of what God might be, and often our image is God's, and we image. I'm not saying that right, but God is made in our image, so whatever we are, and as opposed to seeing the divine in each other, as maybe in humanism. So if you see it in each other, imagine how we would be practicing relationships with one another, like slavery and oppression and things like that. They would be, instead of one over or having power over, it would be a more serving each other. Namaste, I bow to your light, whatever that is. So whether or not you believe in God and how it exists.
This is such a rich discussion, and I really appreciate all of us really opening up and talking about it. I always want to have more of these conversations in my actual congregations, and I still don't know exactly how. Stacy and Perry, I don't know if I've heard you on this point yet, so if you have your thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Well, when you first asked this specific question, I was thinking, well, what God are we talking about? And I was thinking of, what you were saying. The first thing that came to mind for me was, the letting go of the traditional God and that albatross of handed down ideals that is what often people come seeking Unitarian Universalism for. And so, yes, that's what's gained by letting go of that. But then needing to sort of put it back in a different way after that. That's like the typical adult faith formation process, is getting rid of, what you want to get rid of and letting go of that and going through that spiritual transformation, but then saying, now what do I gain? How do I reinterpret, and how do I take back on the pieces of that did serve me, but in a different way, because I have a different filter.
Stacy, did you have any last words for us?
I've been like toying around with the words responsibility and destiny, and the idea that when you shed God from the conversation, that means that really that realm of, you know, how we as humanity as a whole is moving forward is within our own, you know, control, that it's our responsibility to do the right thing, and that we can't rely on this, you know, otherworldly being to direct how things are going to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like that is the gift of our faith that's been handed by humanists to us, honestly. Set up a little bit by transcendentalism, but taken home by humanists is like, no matter what happens, and I think it's formed a core understanding of our Unitarian universal identity, that no matter what happens, religion is our responsibility. Our faith is our responsibility, and so is this world, so is how we act, so what's going to happen. As Kendall Gibbons says in her essay, let me get to it, where is it? Basically, I'm going to sum up. We're not waiting for anybody to just save us and pick us up and everything's going to be fine. There is no everything's going to be fine. It really is on us. And there's a beauty and a freedom in being able to know that we can do this. We can change the world. We can continue to work for justice. We can shape. And also a tremendous, like, it's a hard truth, but a beautiful one, that it ultimately is our responsibility. Pat, any last words on humanism before we go over to Sophia Lyon-Faz?
No, what a great conversation. I really appreciate everyone's insights and the connections that we're making. Great. So we'll move to Sophia. So Ashley asked the question, are we going to go back? We kind of skipped over Channing and Judith Sargent Murray, and so today we're actually going to take, you know, 10 to 15 minutes and just sort of spend a little bit of time more on sort of the biographical aspects of Sophia Lyon-Faz and some of the impacts she's had. But we're going to talk really about the religious education theological lineage when we get to Ocean Grove. So we'll revisit Channing, Murray, and Faz sort of as one piece. So we're not skipping the Inward Springs, of which many of us may also be familiar. That's another big RE Sunday reading, right? So who's heard of Sophia Lyon-Faz? Anybody ever heard of Sophia? You know,
Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? She has been, she was born in 1876. So she was born just, you know, less than a generation after the Civil War. And here it is, 2019, and she is still significantly impacting the work that we do, the everyday work that we do. We are who's heard of the Faz Collaborative at Meadville Lombard? Yeah, she's a significant enough in the world of religious education. By the way, across denominations. That's one of the interesting things. We have claimed Sophia as ours, and we have at our Unitarian Universalist Seminary, we have the Faz Collaborative. But the work that she did really impacted other liberal, progressive, Protestant faiths. So she was born in the late 1870s, and really came of age at the beginning of the 20th century. While she was going to college and eventually going to Teachers College at Columbia, and eventually becoming part of the faculty at Union, you know, she was also raising a whole handful of children. She was working, she was experimenting with religious education right in her own home. But when she started her work really at the turn of the 20th century, even in the Unitarian world, religious education was still very much Bible-centered, and it was centered on sort of an authoritarian premise where there is a word, there is a God, there is a narrative, and we're going to give that as a gift to our children so that they can come into their own knowing and understanding of the stories of the Bible and of the narrative of God as we, the adults, know it. She found that problematic. While she was raising 5 children, she said, wait a minute, my children and the children that I'm seeing in my everyday work are very much spiritual beings. And where that spiritual connection and where that understanding of a sense of higher power comes from is from their own experience. It's how they experience. It's the feelings that grow in them. It's this idea of the beliefs that grow in them, not the things that adults give to them, but things that they discern for themselves. And she very much was a believer that Bible stories can, well, mid-career she may have shifted, but initially she still believed in the value of Bible stories, but believed also that children didn't really make sense to the youngest children, that until a child or a youth reached an age where they could do some interpretation, could understand the historical nature of some of the Bible stories versus this idea of it just being true because I'm told it is so. So there was that shift for her where she really she believed that Bible stories still held value, but that kids needed to be older in order to make sense of them for themselves. She was she made her way. Actually, she was working on all of this. She was at Columbia at a time when John Dewey was there. She knew Maria Montessori. She was connected to a lot of very progressive educators. So she came up in this time where there was really a lot of experimentation going on with how we educate our children, and she transferred much of that into the structure of how we educate our children religiously. She was found by the Unitarians. She was invited by the Unitarian Association, the American Unitarian Association, to work with them and to help them develop a new curriculum, which what became really her seminal work. And some of you may have come across some of the things that she worked on. Has anybody ever heard of Long Ago and Many Lands? I always get that so mixed up. Long Ago and Many Lands, is that it? So she brought this idea of the universal story into religious education, and she also had a series of books called Martin and Judy. I don't know if anybody in this group has ever heard of Martin and Judy. Has anybody ever heard of it? You have, Perry. Okay. I am old enough to have actually experienced the tail end of Martin and Judy in my Sunday school upbringing in the early mid 60s. So these were stories that were about a family, about 2 children, Martin and Judy, and she introduced concepts like the mother was having a baby, which what's religious about this? These were really very progressive topics and ideas. I think there was a child of color that was introduced into their neighborhood. And so Sophia was really she was the beginning of a wave of really looking at religious education in a very different way. She may also have been the one responsible for sort of the craft story song and cookies and juice kind of structure to a lot of our curriculum. that still many of them still have to this day. This idea that there's opening, there's a circle, there's a story, there's an experiential craft or activity for the kids, and then it's sort of wrapped up in the, you know, the praxis of reflection and what this might, how does this, you know, what does this mean for me in my own life and my own experience. So Sophia was really had a significant impact in religious education as we still experience it. So her reach has been far and wide. Does anybody have a sense of how the work of Foz is still resonating in your own work, in your own congregation, in your own understanding of what religious education is?
Another religious educator was telling me that spirit play is kind of based a lot on her philosophy, and so it was interesting to me that she knew Maria Montessori.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, obviously, one piece of her legacy is that idea that we're asking the children to discover for themselves rather than telling them what to discover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she was not, she was an educator, a theologian. She eventually became ordained, but she was in the classroom with the kids. That's where really the majority of her work and her understandings about religious education for children came about. It came about being actually in a room working, you know, one-on-one with children. So the children, at some point, she said, you know, the children educated me as much as I educated them.
Because of those provoking questions and the conversations that come out of it.
Yeah. Anybody else feeling the warmth and the resonance of Sophia Foz?
She actually laid the foundation for how we do religious education. And if you study the history, she elevated what religious education is. And I think that our work today continues to educate congregations on the importance of children in the congregations. So she was a real advocate. And I guess that's the legacy that we religious educators is the wind beneath our wings. Yeah. Is the reason why.
I love that. Yeah, it's true.
I mean, I feel like there's so much legacy, especially if people have already said about children deciding for themselves what their truths are. We see that in the way I feel like Ari has been structured and set up and encouraged, but also just some of her own words and perspectives. For me, the immediate legacy is every single Christmas, you sing a particular song for every child that is born. And it has some issues with some of the wording that we might want to update, but the whole idea of reminding children that it's not just one child born 2,000 years ago whose life matters, but that there is a miracle in birth and in life itself. And so I feel like she's not only a great educator, but a really great theologian, whose words we take into our services, into our literal worship on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, she was doing all of this wonderful progressive thinking and building this new way of doing religious education, and who was pushing back who was pushing back on Sophia in, the 30s and the 40s. The ministers in the congregation, despite the eloquent words of Channing, which which really sort of also elevated this understanding of children sort of being the creators, the meaning makers of their own meaning makers. Ministers pushed back. They said, don't walk away from the Bible. We want you to stay right there in a Bible-centered curriculum. And the other ones who pushed back on Sophia's methods were parents. So does that resonate in our modern congregations at all? Yeah. So there is a question which was from the curriculum that I'm going to post. We only have just a few minutes left, but it's something I want you to think about. And as I said, we are going to revisit the Murray, which really is 18th century, Channing 19th century, and Foz 20th century. And then we're going to be thinking about what are the 21st century influences on religious education. So we're going to kind of look at that frame when we get to Ocean Grove. But one of the articles, Lucinda Nolan, who actually she wrote her PhD on Sophia Foz's work, described reaction to her prophetic theology politely ignored because she was a woman and she worked with children. And the question from the module is, does this have resonance today? I suspect it does. Does anybody have any immediate response or reaction to that?
Well, it's definitely amazing how many congregations, just how congregations view the religious educator and that ministry and program, and it varies a bit from congregation to congregation, but there's certainly a whole legacy of, some places it's as much as the glorified babysitter, and other places it's like, oh, wonderful what you do, like off in the dungeon, like where we don't have to see it and know about it, and you're just taking care of this problem, which is what to do with the kids. But then, moving forward into, okay, what does that mean today in congregational power making and leadership and decision making, and how much does what the religious educator or even the RE committee chairs, where how much influence do they have, and is it separated from real leadership in the congregation?
Yeah, that's great. We have another minute. Any other thoughts on that? All right. We're just about at the end of our day. So we've been on a journey from the 3rd century through to we're in the sort of in the middle of the 20th century, and when we get to Ocean Grove, we're going to dive into what really is sort of our present, sort of the late 20th century and coming into this 21st century, where we're now redefining so many things. Religious education, some of our own theological understandings are shifting. So there's a lot of change that we're undergoing right now. So we're sort of concluding the historical, connections and foundations, and we're going to move into things that are happening and grounds that are shifting right under us right now. Emily, any closing thoughts for today before I get it to a little couple of logistic comments?
No, I think I really appreciate all of you for your insights and for your conversations. These are broad swaths of conversations we've had today. 3 major movements in our larger movement and living tradition, and they're still alive today in many different ways. I find it interesting that our past, of course, is not exactly our present, but continues to influence our present all the time. I have people tell me about Unitarianism. I have people tell me about their humanism. People tell me about Ralph Waldo Emerson all the time, right? So anyway, I'm very thankful for all that you had to say. I'm excited to see you in person and for what we're going to dive into when we're together next week.
Great. Well, great. So we will see you all next Monday. The typical length of a Renaissance module is 15 hours. So each session is sort of 2 to 3 hours. By having these webinars ahead of time, we will have a lot of spaciousness in our time together. So there'll be times where the schedule will say, 1 to 4, but we will be together maybe from 1 to 3, and we're going to give you time either for small group conversations or time for your own self-study. I hope that you have a chance to at least skim most of the written material. I think that we're into, certainly we're into more modern language, not that the concepts are necessarily any easier to chew on, but I think that the language is going to be a little bit easier to wade through. So I hope that you'll come prepared as well as you can, and we will give you some space in our schedule to have a little bit more study time. There's going to be a project, and we'll talk about the project when we get there. You'll have everything you need to do the project. Really is available to you. If you wanted, some groups have put together, a little PowerPoint or newsprint or something like that. You don't have to bring anything except your ideas. If there's something that you've been thinking about, maybe putting together an adult ed workshop about transcendentalism, or something for the youth around liberation theology, which we'll be delving into. There may be, I hope that you can gather into some small groups to do those group projects. So we really appreciate it if you do. You may have an idea about a specific project, and maybe you can invite someone to do that with you, or maybe you can find some common ground to do a project that works for you in your setting and also works for someone else in their setting. So that's what we have to look forward to next week. It's 3 o'clock. Any last minute questions before we say farewell today?
So it is a good idea to try to do most of the reading before we come for the rest of the class.
As well as you can. Yeah, at least a skim.
Yeah.
And as I said, we're going to try to open up some space for you. There is some free time, but there's also going to be some class time that we are going to gift to you to do your continued reading and study.
I had a question, I missed the second session, so you sent us the link to view it?
I did. Did it work for you?
Yeah, so is there anything else we're supposed to do with that?
No, this is a hybrid, so it's not like a typical online module where you have to go on the forum. We didn't have a forum set up. If we did encourage you at some point to do some journaling, to maybe put together some reflections of your own. The reflection questions are in your participant guide. If you're in the credentialing program, those reflections are great to capture because they can help you, when you're documenting for your credentialing process. But we're not asking you to turn anything in, and we're looking forward to letting the mixing and blending happen when we're together in Ocean Grove.
What about our own theological kind of statement?
Yeah, so there was an email that I think went out after the first session in which we invited you to bring those with you when you come, that we'll share those. You can either post them up in our Google folder, or you can just bring it along. We're going to start when we come back together. Our very first activity when we came together online was, what is theology? And we're going to revisit that in a worship mode and in a little bit more embodied fashion. So we're going to start sort of back at the beginning and invite you to maybe share some pieces of your theological statements at that time. Thanks for asking that question, Ashley. I'll send out today's video and try to put some of these little reminders in an email to you as well.
I also want to give a heads up that I've looked over the rest of the reading. One, just to mind that A People So Bold will be the main reading for the last class that we have. So that is, the book is going to be talked about. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it before the class. But as far as actually, for as much as we will cover, the readings themselves are easier to digest than maybe you might have had on our first session about early Unitarianism and early Universalism. So they should be able to be skimmed through before our meeting together. And like we said, we're going to build in time for you to read. And also the additional links that they have in the curriculum, if you're curious about something or not sure about something, there are a lot, but many of them are also easily read too. There aren't a lot of very hard reads linked. So,
yeah. Great. All right. Well, I think we're done for the day, and safe travels to everybody, and we will see you at the beach.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Lacey.